Welcome to the first episode of South Africa on 99.94. I'm not South African. I've been there a couple of times, and Manners occasionally gives me meat from there. But I'm really here to introduce the two hosts. So let's start with there. In the blue corner is Neil Manthorp, one of the greatest cricket commentators living today. When I said living today, it does make you sound really old, does it? I didn't mean it to sound that old. An ultra marathon runner, former Zimbabwean press officer as well. I can't go through his entire resume. Neil Manthorp, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on board. But before I get to you, in the red corner is Lungani Zama, one of the greatest wearer of hats you'll come across in the cricket media, who also sadly happens to be a brilliant feature writer. He's now involved in TV and everything else. Gentlemen, welcome to 99.94 and thank you for joining the podcast network.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, JK.
Now, Zams, you just have a break for a minute because I have to ask Manners a little bit about his career. So that's probably about 25 minutes. We'll try and compress it down to something quite short. Manners, your journey is ridiculously long and arduous even before you started distance running. For those who don't know anything about this, can you tell us about how you broke into the industry by doing radio commentary? But it wasn't radio commentary. It was actually for people who would phone up and call up to get the score, and they could listen to Neil Manthorp commentate a Warwickshire game.
That's right. Yeah, it was in the late 1980s. British Telecom came up with this cunning idea to fleece people for as much money as they possibly could with the institution of premium rate telephone lines. And they were used to encourage people to gamble and call up illicit sex workers, I think, although I'm not sure that they really were sex workers. But people spent many hundreds of thousands of pounds. It was in Britain. And then they decided to set up a sports line. They appointed a commentator for every one of the 18 counties. I think Durham had just been... Were Durham a county
Durham
then?
wouldn't
Or
have
was
been
it
a county
17?
then, so 17.
No, they weren't. Durham weren't a county there. So there were 17 of us, and we followed the teams around, travelled around for 3 years. So we'd have two commentators, and then we'd find a retired pro or somebody else willing to be our co-commentators. And we did ball-by-ball commentary on a full county season, which back in those days was, I don't know, it was about 30 games, wasn't it? It felt like about 50. And we did like 10,000 miles in our second-hand cars. So that's how it started for me.
I don't want you to go through your full resume because, as I said, we will be here for quite a while. But for the 12 people in South African cricket who have never heard of you, can you give us a brief overview of your career from working on the telephone sex line all the way through to today?
Actually, I grew up in South Africa, and then I think it was, this is all a very long time ago, I think it was to avoid conscription into the South African army that my parents encouraged me to go back to the UK, which is where I was actually born. So that's where the journalism started for me. And then I always wanted to return to South Africa, and Julie did. The interesting thing is that my county was Warwickshire, and Alan Donald was the overseas pro, so I became quite good friends with Alan Donald. And one time he came to me and said, "Listen, England have asked me to qualify for them. What do you think?" And I said, "Well, South Africa will be back in international cricket." This was like 89, 90, and he said, "Not a chance. We've been out for 20 years. There's no chance." And I'd heard about the developments with Ali Bakar and the tour to India, so. I'm digressing already. I haven't got out of 1989 yet. Anyway, I've been commentating for the SABC for 30 years in South Africa, and I've written for lots of people, and I now have my own emailer, and there you go, Jarrod. You probably know more about my career in the last 35 years than I do. I can't remember. I've forgotten more than I can remember.
Your last ghostwritten book was Mark Boucher's. Is that right? Current coach? Is that the last one you did?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, it is. And funnily enough, a couple of years ago on a tour to Australia, when would that have been? 2008, 2012. I was asked to be on a panel of speakers at a lavish dinner in Melbourne, and I couldn't work out why on earth they'd chosen me. And it was only when I got to the dinner, and they were paying like $1,000, which is more than I was going to earn for the tour. And it's only when I got to the dinner and I saw who the other guests were, and the two head coaches were Gary Kirsten and Mickey Arthur. And the compere stood up and he said, "Well, we've got the coaches of both teams, and we're fortunate to have in the middle the man who wrote both of their biographies." So that was a good. I earned more money from the dinner than I did from selling the books. But yes, I did Mark Boucher as well. I did a book with Graham Smith as well, and a couple of others.
Our personal history, we could say, for other podcasts going ahead. We have shared a lovers B&B in Manchester once before, and also we once shared Jodie Kidd's childhood bathroom, which actually sounds really icky. Now I've said it out loud, but that is a thing that happened. Zams, luckily you and I have no such filthy stories that we can go into. Your history is quite interesting because you went to Kevin Peterson's school, and you played a lot of cricket yourself. You played, what would you say, semi-professional cricket in England? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Started in a small village called Chelford, and then went to play in the Merseyside competition for a couple of seasons, as an overseas, technically replacing Dwayne Bravo, but not quite as prestigiously because he suddenly got called up for the West Indians, and I snuck in. And yeah, played for a couple of years, and then my parents said I had to come back and finish my studies. And thank goodness they did, because if you're not going to play cricket professionally, if you can write about it, the career is probably going to last a lot longer. And thank goodness it did. So they definitely, as usual, had the right advice. And in the early days, actually, I wrote a lot for Neil Manthorp's company. So we've had a long,
Of course.
and very friendly association with Manthorp and all the superstars in the background who play such a significant role in that company. And learned a lot from Neil, obviously, over the years. Traveled to Sri Lanka and India, particularly with him, and the UK. So yeah, that's my very brief summary. I've not sat in between two coaches who I've written both books, but the one that I have got written was
Yet.
I did sneak in Mike Proctor's book a couple of years ago, which was quite an experience.
First time you've ever called me Neil.
Yeah, I thought that was weird too. I didn't want to correct him, but when he said that, I was like, "Is this okay?" I think on this podcast, of all places, you are officially a manners. When did you started more as a normal cricket writer, but then a little bit more like me, you sort of morphed into more of a feature level writer. How did that sort of come about? Just opportunity, or is that the way that you see your writing?
Yeah, I just had a lot more fun talking about being chucked out of tuk-tuks and taking detours to find random muffin shops in Bangalore, as opposed to writing about ball by ball. And yeah, luckily the company that I wrote for the longest, independent newspapers, were quite keen on, especially on tour, almost having a tour diary and painting a picture about the different countries that we're in, and that came a lot more naturally than the ball by ball stuff. I mean, I still enjoyed that too. Obviously, a massive cricket fan, but to visit all these places and meet all these people and experience those cultures, it was important to try and give the readers that perspective as well.
So we've got your backstories, and you can talk amongst yourselves on future podcasts as much as you want. One thing I did want to talk about was more the South African cricket media. I would say, and it'd be really interesting, I'm going to look at Manners' face, as I often do, to get a reaction here. I would say that all things considered, the way that South African cricket is sort of teetering on the edge of non-existence at times and can't even get a board together, and all the problems they've had with, quotas and race and kneeling and everything else that we'll get to in a bit. I would say that South African cricket media is actually quite strong. If you compare it to, say, New Zealand, where there's almost no full-time cricket writers, I'd say Manners in South Africa, there's actually quite a good coverage of the game, with a lot of talented and writers from sort of different backgrounds as well.
Now there is. There was a problem for the first 20 years of my career, where the problem was that we all looked a bit like me. We were all white males, and it was a significant problem. And for a while you unaware of it. But now I'm delighted to say that we are rightly in the minority, and I think I've learnt more in the last 5 or 6 years about the game because of the diversity of people who are writing about it and covering it. It's been horribly slow to change, but I'm delighted to say that is now the case. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, huge enthusiasm for cricket in South Africa as well. I mean, it's not like New Zealand. I'm not sure that there is a single full-time cricket correspondent in New Zealand. They all are expected to do kayaking and sailing and mountaineering in between the cricket games that they do. But so, I mean, money's a problem. I'm currently on the tour of England, and there's only 3 of us here, whereas there used to be 7 or 8 media on tour, but finance and budgets are a problem. I'm delighted to say and relieved to say that diversity is becoming much less of a problem.
And James, like when the racial committee came about, I felt like there was a lot of different people I could read on it. It was, and again, it was, from someone like Telford Vice, and he had his take on it, and then you had you wrote a couple of incredible features on it. Dan and Manners had his, I think, and Fidos. It just feels like, for everything that's going wrong with South African cricket, it does feel that the media, even if you're all massively underpaid, it does actually feel like there's a lot of people working in cricket media.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like Manna says, the transformation over the last few years, I won't say decade, has definitely been accelerated, and they're important voices because they speak to different communities and different perspectives. Because it's a reflection of the team as well. More and more of the Proteas players, men's and women's, come from small towns that very few people have heard about, but they've got remarkable stories, and obviously they don't play alone in those towns. So there's interest, and I think as you bring in all those different views and voices from across South Africa, the South African story becomes richer for it, and people gain a better understanding of just how deeply embedded the game is across all communities in South Africa, which, as Neil said, wasn't always the case.
And Manners, I mean, you've already aged yourself with your telephone commentary that I made you talk about. You worked through South African readmission, Hansie Cronje, and so many other major, breaking points in South African cricket, or turning points, I should say. It feels like this particular era is a very, very important era for the future of South African cricket, and everything that's going on. From the racial, hearings through to the board basically falling apart, to now, a bunch of Indian businessmen coming in and buying all the franchises. It does legitimately feel like this is a really important time in South African cricket.
There have been a lot of scandals. You're quite right. I mean, there was only one time where you momentarily thought, well, how's the game going to survive this? Which was a bit silly, really. I mean, it was in 2000 and Hansie Cronje's demise with the match fixing stuff in India. But, it felt enormous. It felt like such a vast, massive scandal, which, of course, the game was always destined to recover from. And there have been a lot of of times where we've had to think about the future of the game, but not whether it would survive in a recognizable form. This is the first time where that has been happening. I think now, I mean, with the South African T20 League effectively becoming a mini IPL, there are pros and cons. The biggest pro is that the professional game will survive in South Africa, I assume, because there will be enough revenue generated in order to maintain the first class structure. It's so the South African situation is a microcosm of the world game, because I was thinking, well, the good thing about the Indian money in the IPL coming into Cricket South Africa is that it will be able to continue to maintain its development programs and its grassroots structures, and maintain its first class structure. But the bigger question now is, how much Test cricket is there going to be outside of the Ashes? The small seven nations are playing 2 Test series against each other. I was at Canterbury for 4 days, looking at the people in the good people of Kent, thinking this may well be the last time you see a touring team. You get the opportunity, and I think it'll probably be the last time that I go to a tour match. South Africa was, with respect to Pakistan, over the last 20 years, they had the big three: England, Australia, and India, and South Africa were by and large pretty much in 4th place. But they had a seat at the top table, and until the financial future, I'm assuming it's guaranteed, and I shouldn't make assumptions, I suppose, by the new T20 league, but assuming that it is guaranteed, then I think it's a litmus test. Is that what you were heading for, South Africa, the future and the health of South Africa? Because I think a strong South African team in international cricket is very, very good for the game. I'm digressing again, but I'm thinking of the West Indies. I'm thinking of the West Indies. Jarrod, they are,
you are
within a couple of dollars away from not being a test playing region, aren't they?
No, definitely. I think that's very fair. And I think we probably have learnt more about South Africa being in that kind of situation in the last 2 years than we ever would have thought of them being in that sort of situation. And Sam, so when you look at it, so South Africa cancelled a tour to Australia for a domestic tournament. England quit a tour midway through. The entire board went, kind of. There was a racial tribunal. You had the things about Mark Boucher's history coming up. You had Quinton de Kock's knee. And all the Indians buying a T20 league. I'm sure I'm missing something else, but just in the last year or year and a half, however long that has all taken in that thing, it has been absolutely... South African cricket has been just ping-ponging around the newspapers from headline to headline.
Yeah, the fact that it all happened in a pandemic probably helped to properly cast the necessary light on all these issues. If there was a tour happening across most of them, you kind of gloss over them and you get back and focus on the cricket. But the majority of the key issues, particularly the segregation of the past and dealing with, those issues, historical imbalances, that was very important. And the fact that it was something that could be dealt with and really unpacked on such a public forum was important for the game to now move forward to the place that it is now, where you are more hopeful of the financial future. Certainly, I ran into Temba Bavuma the other day while he's injured, and he said it's a lot more optimistic. Even the conversation around the change room is a lot more optimistic and understanding and respectful. And it wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't always that way. So there were important conversations. And while, the global pandemic was very difficult for a lot of people, I think it also allowed South African cricket to start the healing process. Certainly not heal overnight, but, make everybody understand that, in order for the game to move forward, you need to all be on the same page and have the same level of respect and really get to understand. Because when you do, I think they've taken a leaf out of the rugby book, where everybody's differences are embraced and celebrated. And you'd never think you'd have a big Afrikaner running out onto the field singing a Xhosa song, but they do, and they win, and the fans that they have and the support that they have commercially is a consequence of the fact that it's it's diversity in motion. It's not just something that's said and put on a TV promo. They practice it, and so to take that inspiration and see what it's done for rugby and start implementing it into cricket and start really encouraging all South Africans to play their part. You can't necessarily all play on the field, but the journalism changing, the landscape changing, the commentary. We've got closer commentary. For the first time, people are going to be able to watch an England tour or South African tour of England and listen to it in Xhosa. So it's something.
Look, I tell you what, I will come in here and I will say, Manners, we've been talking probably exclusively about the men. This is also a really important time for the women's South African team. I felt that the women's cricket in South Africa was held back for a very, very long time after readmission, when other nations had got their act together. And then you've now had this South African golden generation when it comes to the women's team. you put all these things in, and you and I, I was in Johannesburg at Wanderers, 15 years after the first time I was there, and the crowd was completely different. It feels like a different time for South African cricket, men, women, all these different backgrounds. But also, what happens to South African cricket if it becomes little more than a breeding ground for English international players and IPL players? Is that a danger going forward?
um, I know that all your instincts are telling me, or my instincts are telling me that you want me to say yes. But
no, you say what you want to say, Manners.
I'm not so sure that it will. I mean, South Africa has overproduced cricketers that can make a living in this country for many, many, many decades. And just a point about the women. I mean, it's extraordinary when you say that the women's game was held back. I mean, almost literally. They're lacking in facilities. The level of prejudice and sexism was truly astonishing. And for the women to have continued to play and to beg, borrow, and not steal club grounds, but to make the use of whatever facilities they could, just to keep the game going. And it wasn't until Momentum came along, who've been a brilliant sponsor for the men's and women's games. And when the men's team and the men's board of Cricket South Africa, the male-dominated board, was behaving so reprehensibly, Momentum said, you know what, we're going to devote ourselves entirely to the women's team, which was a stunning move on their behalf. And that's why I've going to mention them so many times. Momentum. They've done brilliantly. They're a financial services company, and they're a very fine
other financial
sponsor.
Service companies are available as well. But if you want to support the South African women's team,
other financial
support
services
Momentum
companies are available. But yeah, that has been to see the way that women's team has developed and the women's game has developed. I mean, there's still more to be done. But that's really been the most uplifting thing. But going back to the point about the overproduction of players, just the facilities, private schools mostly still, and the weather, and the level at which cricket is played. Again, so I'd like Zams to endorse this. It's still largely at exclusive private schools, still majority white, but things are changing. Anyway, I mean, there's 50 of them, and if each one of them produces one player a year of first class quality, then that's already too many for the first class structure. So guys like Dewald Brevis, I mean, I know Zams and I think we're going to do a whole episode or maybe a dozen episodes on Dewald Brevis, because he's the poster boy of the new generation. I wrote a column the other day about, is he ever going to play for South Africa? And if he does, how's he going to get selected? Because he's not going to play first class cricket. He's now posting videos on social media about how his new family is the Mumbai Indians, and he's going to play for them in the IPL and in South Africa. And so do you know what? I mean, bizarrely, and it does sound strange, but I mean, he's a precocious talent and brilliant cricketer. And South Africa produced lots of them. And if a whole bunch of them never play for South Africa and become 9-month-a-year franchise players, or go and play for New Zealand or Holland or Ireland or the Netherlands, and they all do, then I still think South Africa will be competitive. Weird, isn't it?
Yeah,
couldn't agree more.
James, just to follow up on that, and we'll finish up here, but essentially, one of the great things about the franchise system is that they are looking for talent everywhere, right? And we know how much talent is in South Africa. We also know how much talent is outside of that white public school or private school education. The more money that comes into South African cricket, even if those players don't all end up playing for South Africa, is still huge in what it can do in changing the sport within South Africa, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. Unfortunately, cricket is one of those sports to get into. It's expensive, which is why eventually you have to find your way to a decent school that has decent facilities in order to become a decent cricketer. But yeah, as you say, as more money filters into the right hands, which wasn't always the case in South African cricket, and really starts changing lives from a young age, then you start seeing, these remarkable cricketers coming through, because they are there. There's an over 100-year festival played in the villages, in the Xhosa villages, playing for a goat, essentially, around Christmas. And it's one of the most prestigious cricket festivals in the world. And they've played it for years, so long before they went to private school. So cricket has been played. But to elevate yourself from a backyard cricketer to an international cricketer who could hopefully win big things for South Africa, you do need that financial boost. And not all of it comes from momentum. It's got to come from tournaments such as these that are coming, and sponsors getting behind a team that they feel is representational. So it is coming, and I think the question that you asked, man, is South Africa will always have a competitive team, because unfortunately this is a new South Africa, and we haven't won as a new South Africa. We haven't won anything big in cricket. So that pull to be part of the first team that does that is massive. You ask any other player, you can pay them all the money in the world, but to land a World Cup for South Africa at this time in this unified team and country is something that matters deeply to everyone who puts on that jersey. So there'll always be a competitive South African team, you would think.
I can't believe you just dissed Sean Pollock's Commonwealth Games gold medal right there. But I mean, if that's the way you want to start this podcast, that's how you have. I find it really interesting. When I'm putting all these podcasts together, thinking, I basically set the whole network around Neil Manthorp, because everything has to be Neil Manthorp proof. And I know he's going to ask more questions and be angrier with me than anything else. So I had to make everything Neil Manthorp proof. And one of the things was, oh God, I hope he's got enough to talk about. And then I thought to myself, we're coming up to a World Cup. And generally, someone's turned the lights out on Zams, but generally in a World Cup,
load shedding is a South African term that you'll understand.
I'm very
and it's coming
aware
to
of
the
it,
UK.
Yeah,
Wow.
exactly. But usually at this time, they're playing England, so obviously there would be the fascination with England. But this close to a World Cup, manners, almost normally there would be like this almost existential dread about what will happen with South Africa coming up to a World Cup. But it feels like it's almost just a small part of the story. There is just an incredible amount going on in South African cricket at the moment. And so for while the other podcasts might struggle to come up with content, I assume you guys will be able to do, 5, 6, 7 episodes a week. You should be fine.
A day?
Man, is this face. I wasn't sure if he'd frozen then.
I'm just wondering how many of our viewers, listeners will know what load shedding is. It's the politest term the South African government could come up with. Power cuts. That's what it is. They haven't got enough money to put in the meter, and they haven't got enough coal to put in the power stations. So every 2 or 3 hours, Zams and the rest of South Africa have their power cut. Just bizarre, isn't it? And you must have a battery. Have you got a generator?
A generator. It's coming to the UK. They're running out of power as well. So it is an international phenomenon, much like T20 cricket.
I've been hearing stories about.
That's very much a South African phenomenon. The actual term, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been reading stories about people's heating bills or electricity bills going up from £2,000 a year to £5,000 in the UK. So I think before load shedding gets there, people will just be turning their own lights off.
Exactly. Well, look, I'm not going to make you guys talk anymore. I'm fascinated to see what you two do as a partnership going forward. I'm fascinated to see how often Zams calls you Neil. I think I couldn't have put two better people together for this podcast. So from 99.94's perspective, just a huge thank you to both of you for going. If you are a South African fan and you're listening to this, or you've seen it on YouTube, or you're listening to it on Red Inca, South Africa on 99.94 is the way to find this podcast. Subscribe, rate, review, talk about Manners' hair, talk about Zams' hats, whatever you need to get the attention for these two great men. But just from our perspective, it's a real honor to have both of you on the podcast, and I can't wait to become a listener.
Thanks, JK. Look forward to unfurling a lot of stories and a lot of interesting hairstyles. This is due an upgrade very soon.
Yeah,
I think I'm going to do more upstairs than Manners can. He's a bit more limited, so he's going to be the storyteller, and I'll
It's
just
the
be
shortest I've seen it for ages.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed in it, if we're being honest.
It's not been cut; it's just been tweaked.
Well, just like this podcast, it's not been cut, it's just been tweaked. And so this is my last episode on this podcast. So from now on, I hand over to the two great men ahead of us, and I can't wait to listen. So thank you so much for joining today. Remember, subscribe to them, rate them, press the little bell thing, review them, do whatever you can, and listen to as many South Africa on 99.94 episodes as you possibly can. Thank you, gentlemen.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Cheers
Jarrod.
for now.
Chat soon.